America's working class has been cheated. That is an assertion.
Open border tornado.
No, that's a Koch brothers proposal.
And the Democrats jumped right on board with the corporatists. They got in bed with Wall Street, military-industrial complex, the fossil fuels, Silicon Valley. And now look what happened to the country. We have the biggest income disparity since the Gilded Age. Bigger than that. There's more.
Expanded trade has thrown the working class into much more competition than they experienced before trade with lower wage countries took off.
Can say is that as a country, we have to make a different set of choices because the choices we've made have hurt working people.
Congressman, because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
Hello, and welcome to another Institute for Sound Public Policy podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Lynn, and today is Thursday, August 22nd, 2024. And I have a great guest with us here today, waiting in the green room, and I'm going to bring him in, and it is Dmitry Orlov. And for those who've been following us for a long time, you know that he is no stranger to the podcast. All right, and while we're waiting for Dmitry to come in, I'll do a quick little bio on him for those who may not be familiar. Now, Dmitry, welcome.
Good to be with you. It's been too long.
It has been too long. It's been 2 years since our last podcast, which was shortly after the Russian-Ukraine war kicked off. And then 8 years ago, we did a panel here in the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was you, James Howard Kunstler, Chris Martenson, Frank Morris, John Michael Greer, and boy, some of those things, because I was going back and looking at it, it's almost like we were a bunch of Cassandras talking about, the kind of things that can happen. Now, Dmitry, I want to do a quick bio on you for those of our audience that may not be familiar. Now, you're an engineer, you're a writer, and you've written an awful lot on potential political, economic, and ecological collapse. Your seminal work was Reinventing Collapse, which now it's important for everyone to know that you immigrated to the United States in 1976. You were the same age. You were, 13 at the time? And your father was a professor who taught initially at Cornell University. You went through our education system here, got an engineering degree. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, you went back and you chronicled what was happening. And that is all in your book, Reinventing Collapse. And it's an amazing book in that Tom Hartman had mentioned that, writes that Orlov holds that the Soviet Union hit a soft crash because of centralized planning in housing, agriculture, and transportation, left an infrastructure private citizens could co-opt so that no one had to pay rent or go homeless, and people showed up for work even when they were not paid. He writes that Orlov believes the U.S. will have a hard crash, more like Germany's Weimar Republic in the 2020s. And our mutual friend, James Howard Kunstler, described you as one of Orlov's greatest fans, but denies he is a complete collapsitarian. Described your book as exceptionally clear, authoritative, witty, and original view of our prospect. And so, Dmitry, great to have you on the show.
Good to be with you.
Super. What I wanted to start out with is I was shocked, and I'll pull up my screen again here. I'll share my Safari with you. Here we go. So, recently, Putin put out a proclamation saying Russia offers safe haven for people trying to escape Western liberal ideals. Dmitry, is Russia going to become a immigration hotspot? What is going on here? What drove Putin to make this? Is because, as you know, immigration is a topic near and dear to my heart. It's something I've been heavily engaged in for the past, really since 2007. And especially after 2016, when I became the executive director of this organization I helped found. But what is going on with this proclamation, Dmitry?
Okay, first of all, it's not a proclamation. It's a presidential order. And here it is. I have it printed out.
Interesting.
And I've gone through it. It's Russian legalese.
Okay.
And it provides orders, specific orders to various parts of the Russian government, making it easier for people who are looking for a safe haven from the madness that's gripping the West to come to Russia. Because previously it was a rather difficult process. In order to get residency in Russia, you had to have a Russian wife or husband.
Right.
For over 3 years. You had to have a young child or adolescent who is a Russian citizen living in Russia. You had to have a parent who is a Russian citizen living in Russia. There were a few other categories, but other than those categories, fluent speaker of Russian. But that's...
Oh, really?
I passed that test, but I don't know any other American who would.
So even someone who was a native speaker would have trouble with that test?
Maybe. I'm not sure. But I passed with flying colors. That wasn't an issue. But you basically have to prove that you use Russian every day in everyday life for all sorts of things, for work, for family life, for everything. So other than that, you had to fit into a quota. Now, if you wanted to move to Murmansk, then there would be plenty of quotas. But then what would you do in Murmansk? There aren't that many jobs except for the government there, and you can't work for the government as a foreigner. So period, the end. But if you try to do that in Moscow, forget it. Those quotas get snapped up immediately.
Okay.
What this does is open a new sluice gate, if you will, allowing people to go to the Russian consulate in the country where they live and file a request for a 3-month visa to go to Russia and receive a temporary residency permit. Now, a temporary residency permit requires you to do a number of things in order to apply for it. I think I have them written out. First of all, if you ever advocated violent government overthrow, doesn't matter which government, you're out. You can't have financed terrorism, that is any organization recognized by the Russians as terrorist. You can't have been deported from Russia during the previous 5 years. If you provide any fake documents or information, if you have ever been sentenced for various crime or for selling drugs. And then there's the category multiple offenses against public order, which could be traffic tickets for all I know.
Right.
But you have to have some substantial number of them, judgment call. And then if you get that residency permit, by the way, you have only 3 months to do it because your police record from wherever you're from showing that you've never been arrested or sentenced for any major crime expires after 3 months. So you only get 3 months to do all of this, jump through that hoop. But if you're not working for continuous 180 days or are broke, then your temporary residency permit will be annulled and you will be deported. Or if you work but are making less than the minimum income level in the part of Russia that you're in, Every part of Russia has a different minimum income level, but that's not very high. Then again, excuse me, your temporary residency permit will be annulled. There are some exceptions, though. Students, retirees, and what are called invalids, which is people with various serious handicaps. But having your handicap recognized by the Russians requires you to go through a medical committee. So a lot of people have trouble with that. A lot of Russians have trouble with that. Like, I don't have a leg. Am I an well, we'll see. We'll call it a committee. So if you're homeless for 3 years, you lose your temporary residency. If you leave Russia, if you spend more than 6 months outside of Russia, annulled. Various other categories. So basically, you have to play it safe. You have to be very careful. But basically, you collect the paperwork, you get the visa first, because the visa allows you to enter during a month or so, for 3 months.
Okay.
So you basically, you have to devote some effort to collecting this paperwork in the right order. And then you go to Russia, and then you get your temporary residency permit, and then you try very hard to get a job if you don't have savings.
Gotcha.
And so this is not totally trivial. And this is just a temporary residency permit that expires after 3 years. Hold on a second. That expires after 3 years. It cannot be extended. So during that time, you have to apply for a permanent residency permit, which does require a test of the ability to speak, read, and write Russian. You have 3 years to learn Russian.
In that 3 year period, you have 3 years to learn Russian. You have to obey the law, because I imagine if there's any kind of infringement, those are grounds for deporting someone.
Exactly.
Who are the immigrants that Russia wants to attract?
People with advanced degrees, especially technical degrees. Mm-hmm. That's basically it. Young people with families with advanced technical degrees.
Okay.
So if you know how to make microchips and have 3 children, Russia is the country you want to live in.
Interesting. Now, what year did you return to Russia, Dmitry?
2017.
Okay. And what has your experience been since you returned?
Overall, I'd say positive. It took me, even though I'm fluent in Russian and nobody here has any idea that I spent so many years outside the country. I just blend in. It took me a long time to figure out how things work over here, and a lot of it had to do with developing a certain type of patience. You see, in Russia, a lot of stuff is just kind of free, but you wouldn't say it's free for the taking. You can't show up and demand it. There's a certain amount of finesse involved, and a certain amount of social capital and acumen required for just about anything. Getting your kid into a good school, or getting the medical treatment you need. There are a lot of. It's basically socialism, and not everybody, especially people in the United States, likes socialism. And the other thing is that socialism tends to be pretty harsh, because you have to deal with people on a social basis. It's not like.
Okay.
You have to, if you want socialism to work for you, you have to be social and socialize. You don't just get in line. You don't just file paperwork. People have to like you in order to help you.
Really? Because, it's interesting you say that, because, as you know, I'm the founder of a group called U.S. Tech Workers, and we push back against these employment visas that push American tech workers out of jobs. And the reason our corporatocracy has been so successful at displacing Americans in the IT sector is because they're so atomized, socially atomized. I don't know if you remember back in the late 90s, there was that book by Poe Bronson, The Nudist on the Late Shift, about a guy who would, at 2 in the morning, he'd be coding naked at his desk or something like that. It's, again, a lot of antisocial behavior. But what you're saying is it's almost like, where in capitalism we tend to be more atomized. We have our house with our yard. When I lived in Los Angeles, you would typically not know your neighbors. You'd fraternize with people you knew at work or through other circumstance, but your neighbors you really didn't know. And that seems to be kind of typical for Americans on the whole. So you're saying it's very different there in Russia.
It's very different in Russia. First of all, Russians have to help each other. They have to.
When you say have to, what do you mean by that?
If you don't want to get seriously hurt, you will help people in need.
Really?
Yes, it's mandatory. It comes from a tradition that goes back to Genghis Khan, a Mongol who failed to render assistance to another Mongol while traveling was punished by death.
Wow.
That's the great yatsa of Genghis Khan, his codex of laws. So some of that survives in Russia today. So if you get stuck on the road, a trucker will pull over and will be extremely upset because you're slowing him down. But he will pull you out of the ditch. Saying thank you to him will cause him to snarl at you while driving away.
Really?
Gratitude is pointless. He's just doing what he has to. And that's just all over the place.
Interesting. Wow, that's a very interesting social perspective. In a little bit, I'm going to play a clip from that panel we did 8 years ago where you talked about immigration. But what's not in that clip, I recall you making a statement during that panel where you talked about the Amish. And in all of America, there's probably not another group that invests more in that next generation than the Amish. And, having lived here in Lancaster County for several years now, I grew up in Pennsylvania, but not here. They are a very socialistic group, like you were talking about in Russia. And they don't have to pay Social Security, FICA, these things, because they take care of their own. It would be an insult to them if there was someone in their community in need, in genuine need, someone who wanted to be productive and couldn't be, and that person wasn't being taken care of. That would be an insult to that community. And we seem to have gone pretty far afield from that here in the United States.
Well, yes, Americans are strange in that on the one hand, they're just absolutely dependent on things working around them. Lights go out and suddenly everyone is just lost. And on the other hand, they believe in some version of rugged individualism and their own rights, and they demand. Americans tend to demand things. To a Russian, that's just not polite behavior. That's just somebody brought up wrong, from the Russian point of view.
It's interesting. Max Hastings years ago wrote a book on the Korean War, and he was talking about prisoners of war, the Allied POWs of North Korea. And in it, he said, the Americans fared the worst in these, because the conditions were really brutal. But in those conditions, rugged individualism fails. He said the British did much better because, they would really pick the lice off each other and things like that. And then, of course, he said the Turks did the best because compared to the Turkish army at the time, it wasn't so bad. But you have to be able to come together on these things. So, but yeah, we do have an issue there, and I would love to see more of that. But the problem is good intentions here, being virtuous and helping others, tends to get bastardized by so many groups out there that survive. They virtue signal, they claim to be helping, but really they're not. Like they claim to be helping the homeless, but we have more homeless. They claim to be, fighting drug addiction, but we have more drug addiction. There just doesn't, and I guess we could wax Nietzschean on this, a will to power among people. But before we get into some, because I do want to go down some other rabbit holes with you, I want to kind of circle back on immigration. I want to share what you said 8 years ago on that panel when we were discussing immigration, and then kind of see, kind of compare and contrast what you see, what Russia is aspiring to do, what the U.S. is doing, what Europe is doing with regard to immigration. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and play that clip.
Actually, so that your viewers aren't shocked, I was in disguise at the time. I was sporting an Amish beard. So
yeah, yes, there you go. All righty, here we go, and share, and I'll play that now.
A lot of countries are doing. So I'm a first-generation immigrant, and I know a lot of immigrants and have lived as one. There are a lot of angles to this. One is that national borders are very inconvenient from the corporate point of view. Corporations like to treat labor as a fungible commodity, basically shipping it to wherever it's required and then shipping it out again when it's no longer required. It creates this homogeneous cosmopolitan society where nobody is invested in any particular place, and that makes them very easy to manipulate and control, and destroys any sense of place that they might have had. Yes, it destroys the working class, especially in the United States, because there are all these people, not highly trained, that slosh over the border and do simple jobs. On the other hand, the United States would collapse without highly trained specialist foreign labor. Most of the corporations in the U.S. are completely at the mercy of these guest workers. So I see that happening as well. And then a lot of these people are going home. A lot of people get degrees in the U.S. and then just go home these days because they don't see a future for themselves and their kids in the U.S. A lot of them stay here for a while, they work, then they have children, and the moment they have children, it's like back to the home country.
Interesting.
Because they don't want to lose their children to America.
When you say...
And there's a lot of emphasis now, and I know a lot of people like that who are immigrants in name only. They're really migrants. They're here while the grass is greener for them in their particular situation, but they're not going to lose their roots in the sense of...
Well, speaking about while the grass is green, why do we...
All right. Wow. So 8 years ago, those were your sentiments regarding immigration. Have they changed at all now that you have returned to Russia? And as you're watching what's really been going on probably the last 4 years in terms of these migrations from over 120 countries that are going, people are like here in the U.S., people from over 120 countries have been found coming across our borders and completely uncontrolled. It's believed that over 10 million people have illegally crossed into the U.S. in the last 3.5 years. And Europe is being transformed, and not necessarily by illegal immigration, but Dmitry, by legal immigration. I mean, look at the United Kingdom. Look at Germany. It seems the only bastion is Switzerland, where they're still maintaining significant control over their immigration system. But, that might be changing. So love to get your thoughts on all of that.
Well, first of all, in the interest of full disclosure, at the time that I said that, sporting that beard, I was, as the Russians say, waxing my skis. Less than a year later, I was in Russia and my family was in Russia, and I was jumping through the various bureaucratic hoops getting my Russian citizenship, and which I have now. And so I'm not leaving Russia. I'm content here. I will stay here for the rest of my life. And so I am one of those people who spent a long time, decades working in the United States in various capacities. I had several careers. But when it was time for my son to go to preschool, I looked around and I said, no, we don't breed in captivity. We're going.
What do you mean by that? Because it's funny. A good friend of mine, they live in the Bay Area in California, and for their children, and these are, the oldest one is 7 now. It's going to cost them to go to a good private school $20,000 for them to get that education that might, put them on the trajectory to success in life. So I just say that as a footnote to what you're about to say.
Yes, well, I actually did some exploring. I talked to public school teachers and private school teachers and super duper private school teachers in Manhattan that cost like $100,000 a year or something ridiculous like that. They all pretty much said the same thing. We're not teaching kids anything useful. It's all just nonsense. And there are problems with the Russian educational system. A lot of them have been the result of trying to reform Soviet education and failing. A lot of schools are now going back to the Soviet model because it's much more successful. But it's overall much better. It's much better. The result is kids who are far more knowledgeable and intelligent and skilled.
Mm-hmm. Now, why would you say that? Now, obviously, like you said, they're maybe going back to aspects of the Soviet model that were working. Is there a cultural issue there too? Because, if you take out the worst of schools, I mean, Americans do exceptionally well on these generalized tests for science, math, and everything. So it's not like we're not producing talent here, but it's getting getting your kids on that trajectory is becoming very, very difficult to access that on-ramp. Because, public schools just are falling down. Where I live here in Lancaster, not one school is viewed as exceptional. We have average and below average schools here. And everyone seems to be fine with that because that's been the way things have been for a few decades now. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts? Why would you go back to Russia with the primary concern being the education of your child?
Well, it wasn't the primary concern. It was just that it prompted us to do it right there and then. But in terms of my own experience, the difference between American education back when it was supposedly good and Russian education back in the Soviet days, I covered this in one of my books, but basically I left Russia out of 6th grade, went into 8th grade in American school, didn't do a lick of math until the 12th grade, and then went into engineering. So the amount of math that I learned in Russia by the time I reached 6th grade was enough to get me into engineering school in the United States. That should give you an idea of the complete uselessness of school education in the United States.
Wow. And are you pleased with what you're finding there in Russia?
It's fairly reasonable. I think that the major problems are that Western-style liberalism has made some inroads in Russian education. So you can't order kids around. You can't expel kids for bad behavior. Basically, the methods that teachers have had for disciplining are missing and have to be brought back. And it wasn't physical punishment or anything like that, but there were ways of disciplining kids, and kids were much better behaved back in Soviet schools than they are now. So I'm all in favor of bringing back aspects of the old Soviet system, including school uniforms and all of that.
Okay. And they don't have that now. I thought they did. I guess I was wrong.
Some schools do, most schools don't.
Okay. So, yeah. So what are your thoughts on when you look at immigration and United States, Europe today? And what should you had gone through Putin's order, and is that pretty much a response to looking around at what has been going on with regard to immigration in the West, do you think?
No, not at all. Basically, what Putin sees as main threats that require emergency measures are various types of extremism, social extremism, coming from the U.S. and other hostile nations. Mm-hmm. That is his language. Transnational corporations are a threat to Russia. Foreign NGOs are a threat. And certain unnamed Russians are a threat. And he sees the main threat as the introduction of destructive ideologies that destroy the Russian value system: egoism, lassitude, immorality, a negation of patriotic ideals, family, marriage, children. And he singles out LGBTQ+ as a threat. Mm-hmm. So basically what his thrust is to bring back traditional values, including with the help of people around the world who want to embrace those values. And he describes them in another order number 809, strategic planning document, preservation and strengthening of traditional Russian spiritual, moral values, culture, and historical memory. So that's what he's driving at with his thrust to liberalize immigration into Russia. He's not aping what's happening in Europe or the United States by any stretch of the imagination.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you pointed all that out, because that was really what I wanted to discuss with you. What is the most salient? What is the salient feature of this? And is he just basically saying, "Oh my gosh, we got a demographics problem. We need so many people." So it's more of a qualitative rather than a quantitative approach, correct?
Absolutely. He spells out what traditional values are. And although the word Russian in English is the only word that's being used in Russian, there are two different words, Русский and Российский. Русский is an ethnic term. It defines the language and the Russian ethnos. Mm-hmm. But there's such a thing as the Russian superethnos, which includes all of the other nations within the Russian Federation, which all of them speak Russian and some of them speak their own native language. That varies very widely. But then there's the term Российский, which applies to the Russian Federation, not to the ethnicity.
Okay.
So the traditional values that Putin is driving at, as to the spiritual / moral values, culture, and historical memory, apply to all of the nations of Russia, not just the Russians. So it's very important to keep that in mind. Out from the outside, they all look Russian. From the inside, you wouldn't want to mistake a Chechen from an Ingush. Okay, they're different nations. But they're traditional values that have various commonalities as far as he's concerned. They're passed from generation to generation. They're a basis of common identity. They provide for a unified cultural space. And they're expressed in a wide variety of ways by the many nations of the Russian Federation. That's his language. So what are they? They are dignity, freedom, patriotism, civic duty, service to fatherland. Now, okay, that has. I need to mention that if you
Sure.
if you go through the process and receive the temporary residency permit, which expires for 3 years, and a while before it expires, several months before it expires, you have to apply for the permanent one, or you go back to square one. So
Okay.
you get the permanent residency permit for 5 years. Within that 5-year period, I believe you have to apply for a citizenship. The moment you get that citizenship, if you're a man of service age, you have to register to serve. And if there is a military action going on, you may be called up to serve.
Now, question. I know I've read blogs where there have been a number of Indians that have settled in Russia, and they're kind of being used as cannon fodder for the war. Is that accurate or not?
Well, nobody's being used as cannon fodder for the war. I haven't heard of any such thing. That's a Ukrainian thing. The Ukrainians will take anybody, any kind of a mercenary, and send them to die. And the Ukrainians are dying on the order of 2,000 a day at this point.
What do you think casualties on both sides so far have been, Dmitry?
Well, on the Russian side, it's a state secret. Putin has said that the casualty rate on the Russian side is 7 times lower. But then there's a big difference. The Ukrainians tend to abandon their dead and their wounded, and to cut up their wounded for parts, which they sell, kidneys, etc., instead of giving them treatment. There's a big black market in Ukrainian kidneys. Wow. And so they don't. A lot of the people who get wounded on the Ukrainian side end up dead, whereas on the Russian side, the wounded are taken care of extremely well, and 97% of them return to active duty after treatment.
Really? That's a huge number.
Yes. So a lot of emphasis on the Russian side is on pulling the wounded out of action. There are lots of weapons to do that. They even have robotic tractors that you lay down on top of if you're wounded, and it'll haul you across the landscape, like jumping around like a rabbit, out of harm's way. So it's very different. The two sides in the conflict are very different. But I would say that something like 10 to 1 is probably a reasonable ratio in terms of casualty rates.
That's an order of magnitude. When you use the term, when Putin uses the term freedom, what is he talking about?
Well, you see, there's political correctness in the United States. You have to, and I, while I'm talking to you, have to be very careful in terms of the words I use and what I speak about and how I speak about things. Violating political correctness leads to almost, banishment, cancellation. So,
or in my case, a page on the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Yeah, well, that too. So in the United States, there is really no freedom of speech. Everybody has to watch carefully what they say. In Europe, too, there's this thing called hate speech, which is defined by whoever wants to do something about hate speech. There isn't really a workable legal definition. In Russia, it's pretty much a free-for-all. What you can or cannot say is rather carefully defined. So you cannot spread hatred in terms of things like sex or ethnicity. You cannot spread terrorist ideas and extremism, and you cannot spread state secrets or lie about them. Okay. You cannot lie about the actions of the government. There are a few more categories, but it's very well defined. And if you run afoul of any of them, you know that you've done something wrong. It's not like something You said you used the wrong word, which used to be okay 2 years ago, but now it's not. Like woman. Just wait 3 years from now.
Who'd have thunk? Who'd have thunk? It's yeah. I mean, would have been laughable a decade ago in terms of people, with their pronouns and all these other little rituals you must go through when talking to people. I mean, it would have been laughable a decade ago, and now it's serious. I mean, it's almost like Orwell's 1984 was a primer for what's come here in the West. So I'm glad you took the time to really go through that order, Dmitry, because years ago I watched that movie Reds, and these Americans were filled with this communist ideology, and it's like, we're going to go to the Soviet Union and live on a collective, and it's going to be great, only to find the reality didn't match that. And my concern is a lot of Americans like, yeah, I'm going to flee neoliberalism and wokeness and go to Russia, and they may not, if they, like you said, if they're not capable of learning Russian to a degree of fluency, if they find themselves not being able to find work in that environment, it probably wouldn't be a good experience for them.
Yes, getting used to what it means to be Russian and actually becoming Russian is not trivial. I wouldn't so far as to say it's an ideal. Lots of people just absolutely love it. I mean, Russia has a history of people coming here and quote unquote going native, and it happens all the time. And what's more, people who spend a significant amount of time in Russia are forever altered by this fact. You can pretty much spot them from the distance because their attitudes toward life are suddenly different from the rest of the people. So it's not a trivial thing to get used to what it means to be Russian. As a sort of trivial example, Americans smile with their teeth.
Right.
Russians do bare their teeth towards people or bears or wolves.
Interesting. I've noticed talking to Russians here in the U.S., they really find that being affable, the way we're very affable here and we'll smile, and they find that kind of disturbing. They don't like that. It's like, laugh and smile when you really, really feel it. Other than that, just kind of be a little more stoic.
Well, yes, the Russians, they if you smile while there is nothing obvious to smile about, such as something funny, or something joyous like a reunion, then you're a fool. And the Russians think that people who smile for no reason are just idiots. So if you go around Russia and smile for no reason, people will think you're an idiot. And in Russia, they don't really like idiots. So that's something to keep in mind. And laughter and smiling are the same thing in Russia. So if you smile at somebody, they might think you're laughing at them, you're mocking them. It's not like in the United States, smiling is a form of politeness. In Russia, smiling could be a form of impoliteness. It could be downright rude, depending on circumstance. And of course, baring your teeth, grinning is just not done.
Interesting. Looking at from a cultural, expanding on the cultural, would you say that line of demarcation between Orthodox and Roman Catholicism, that's kind of a cultural border then in terms of, who Putin would like to see enter his country?
Not really. I don't think there's much of an issue with Catholics in Russia. There are Catholic churches in Russia. There's a major one that just went through a renovation. Quite beautiful, old brick building. So the Catholics are allowed here, and there's a communion between Catholic and Orthodox churches. Um, there are Catholic churches that are Eastern Rite churches. That is, their services are almost identical to services in Russian Orthodox churches. The
Armenian,
reverse,
for instance.
well, Armenia is a completely different church, and
Okay.
it's an ancient heresy as far as the rest of Christianity is concerned. They're monophysites. So yes, I think Catholicism is acceptable in Russia. That is really not a big issue, and you can go from being Catholic to being Orthodox, and some people do.
So, departing from immigration, I'm glad to have rediscovered your Boosty site because I'd lost track of you for about a year because it's been very difficult for people from Russia to communicate with people here in the United States. Certainly, there's no commerce being transacted between us or any individuals on one side of the divide or the other. When I watched the opening ceremonies of the Paris Olympics, and I was mortified by what I saw. Despite the apologies that had nothing to do with a vulgar take on the Last Supper, I just found the whole thing to be just really an awful display that just seems to be pushing an agenda that a lot of people, not only are they not ready for, they simply don't want. And I read your blog, and you referred to some, you viewed it as Luciferian, and I just love to give your take on that, the opening ceremonies, and then how we can then look at what is going on from a cultural standpoint and what the powers that be seem to want where they want to put us as a people in terms of our culture and our mores, our norms.
Well, the essay that actually, before we launch into that, I wanted to bring up one more thing about this order, right?
Okay.
Just to show what a legalistic mind Putin has. Okay, this order is based on another order, and it actually goes to provide for, or it follows up on a provision in a previous order, provision 3.23.b. International image of the Russian Federation as the keeper and defender of traditional values. That's what it's
a great segue into what I want to talk about. And Putin culturally is a fan of the West. He always has been, hasn't he?
Well, he lived in Germany for a while. He learned to blend in Germany pretty well. He speaks fluent German. He even can emulate various German dialects, local dialects. And so for him, I think personally, it was a bit of a disappointment that he had to basically kiss the West goodbye. But at this point, I think that he is reconciled to the idea that there isn't going to be very much going on between his government and the governments of the countries to the West, except for Belarus.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think he's reconciled. He's reconciled himself to that. And he's now much more interested in looking east, and that's working out really well. He's cultivated personal relationships with people in China and Vietnam and North Korea and Iran and Syria and places south. So that's the new atlas of the world as far as Russia is concerned. the little peninsula that's jutting off into the North Sea and the little island next to there and whatever is across the ocean doesn't matter to him anymore.
Wow. And to me, that's a tragedy. And I think it could end up being a tragedy for Russia in the long run, because when you look at Russia versus China, they can find themselves being consumed by China and forces from that sphere again. Whereas there seems to be a much more, a stronger cultural bind between Russia and Europe, the rest of Europe, than there is if they were to go the Sino route and into the East.
Well, if you look at the history of Russia, they were attacked by the Poles and the Lithuanians. There were various
the Pontiac Wars.
Several crusades staged by the Swedes, where they attacked Karelia and burnt monasteries there. None of that is forgotten. Of course, many wars with the Germans, the Livonian Order, lots of bitter conflict there. Then the French under Napoleon. Then, of course, various interventions by the British, the Americans, and the French right after the October Revolution, 1917. And that's just top of the list. And now we have quote unquote Ukrainian troops messing about on the Russian border in the Kursk region. So it never ends. And who needs friends like that? Nobody needs friends like that. So Russia used to be forced to cooperate with Europe because Europe would develop new weapons or various new technologies, and Russia needed access to those technologies, so they had to cooperate on some level. That is no longer the case. Neither the United States nor Europe develops anything that is of interest to Russia. All of the innovation has moved east. And all of these old world and new world countries, European and the United States, are being left behind. A good example of that is hypersonic rocketry. The countries that have it are Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and Yemen. But the Americans have been testing these rockets, and none of their programs work. And they've pretty much given up on it, although they're pretending that they're doing something about it. But it's all a waste of money because they don't have the engineers of the right quality anymore. They just don't make them anymore. And for defense needs, they can't import a bunch of smart Russians and Chinese and Indians to do the work for them.
No, unfortunately, we've been displacing our skilled workers with foreigners, thinking that the solution is not to develop within, which is what we did when, the response to the space race was to develop our talent inside the country, not to import it, although we did import a couple of Nazis to help with that. But so did the Soviet Union. But yeah, it's I don't see that emphasis again locally. I don't see it here locally. I see that our universities right now are amazingly fond of foreign students because it represents a very willing student body that's prepared to pay full freight with a green card being baited in front of them. So the universities, really, quality is gone. I mean, we saw that with, engineering-wise, with the CrowdStrike debacle that took down all of these systems, airline systems and everything, where when American engineers were involved, they would have been doing the in-house work to make sure that it wouldn't just be like hit a button and take the update from CrowdStrike. It would have been like, okay, in-house, we take it, we play around with it and, take that image. And then after we're satisfied it works, push that image out to all of our customers in either the company, the university, the government unit. None of that's done. There's no documentation anymore. So we're losing it on a lot of levels. The excellence is there at the very top, as always. It always has been and probably always will be. But the people that are doing the work, the people wearing the pocket protectors at Northrop Grumman and everything, doing the more ordinary engineering tasks, I think they're becoming fewer and far between. And that's a tragedy in terms of competitiveness, national security, but also personally. These were all great paying jobs, and they're literally being taken away from Americans. So we have our issues there. I won't deny that.
Well, it's to the point where there are just a handful of defense contractors, and Boeing is absolutely sick, absolutely just devastated. And the reason for that is who was it being run by? It wasn't run by an engineer. Well, it was run by an accountant.
Right, and because they moved their headquarters down to D.C. and St. Louis from Seattle. My father flew. He started on the old Constellations. He was a flight engineer, then went to the 707 and then the 747. And when they were developing the 707, a group of government officials and potential buyers had come to take a look at it, and the test pilot took it up, and he was just supposed to go around and come back, but he did a barrel roll with the 707. And it just highlighted the fact that we used to over-engineer things, and we don't seem to do that anymore. The redundancies aren't there because, well, all that stuff is being outsourced. You don't have that quality control. And my sister used to work with healthcare benefits and everything, and Boeing was one of her clients, and she would always remark, this is years ago, how absolutely squared away they were in every facet of that business. It was a pleasure to work with them, and all that has just dissipated away. It's again, like you said, it's kind of that getting back to that financialization of our economy, where the quarterly profits outweigh actual productivity, qualitative improvements, innovation, things like that are sublimated to this, efficiency model. And we'll be releasing at the end of this month the report on the semiconductor industry from a labor perspective for the 20th and 21st centuries, looking back and looking forward. And you look at someone like Intel that absolutely dominated in the 80s and into the 90s, and we pushed all that work overseas because it was more, you could make more profit that way. And now as a result, they just laid off 15,000 people. And this is after having received $8.5 billion in CHIPS Act funding for the goal of bringing more manufacturing here and employing more Americans. It's a mess. And I'm hoping we'll get leadership in here that will put the needs of Americans first. But, that you never know with today's political environment.
Well, getting back to Putin, a while ago, he said that the United States is going the way of the Soviet Union. And I immediately wrote an article saying Putin agrees with me. Because he's been saying that for a really long time. But I think that the reason that Putin took this big gamble of basically saying what the Ukrainians are doing to the Russians in the former eastern Ukraine will not stand, and started the special military operation, he knew that he would get massive blowback from the US and from NATO. But he knew that all he had to do was bide his time, because he knows that the US and Europe are finished. He knows that a couple more years of this, and there won't be a United States. There will be just a bunch of states.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows that there won't be a European Union. There'll be just a bunch of European countries, small ones, insignificant ones, including Germany. Germany is past peak. You know, its peak was in 2008.
Why do you think Germany has been so quick to get rid of its manufacturing, so quick to get rid of its nuclear energy? What's going on there from your perspective,
Well,
Dmitry?
it's the green disease. You know, look at who's in their government. You know, you have the Green Party there, and they allowed themselves to be bamboozled by this idea that human activity has something to do with the climate of the Earth. And, you know, all of that is pretty silly. I mean, yes, the Earth is warming, and lo and behold, the moon is warming too. Is that due to human activity? You know, Mars is warming, Venus is warming. Has to do with solar activity and space rays.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we don't seem to want to. Yeah, it was funny. Years ago, I was speaking with these scientists from one of the national labs, and they were Arctic scientists. And they were quick. This was just as we were going from global warming to climate change, because all of a sudden, the models weren't supporting global warming, but it's like, oh, we're going to have these big weather events and everything. And this is the tragedy. Yes, the weather does, you know, the climate does change. But weather ultimately is not that much more extreme than it was when we were kids.
Well, it could get much more extreme, but saying that it has something to do with fossil fuels is a bit of a stretch, I would say, at this point. And the fact is, the Earth is in the middle of an ice age. It's likely to get much colder within the next couple of thousand years. What that has to do with us? Nothing. We're going to be just completely ignored. Mm-hmm. But the Germans and the other Europeans really believed it and got bamboozled into following this green strategy and trying to change their economy to run on renewable, quote unquote, renewable fuels, thinking that solar panels and wind generators made in China are renewable. No, they're not. They're renewable as long as the Chinese are willing to sell them to you on credit. After that, they become non-renewable, and they don't work that long. And what's more, dismantling them is more expensive than putting them up because they're all difficult to get at and toxic.
Right, and many of the components rely on the best components are from rare. You know, the magnets come from, you know, are built with rare earth minerals, and those come primarily from one section of the world, not here in the U.S. We do have some, but very, very few to build out something like that. It's and again, too, we used to make all of that here, but it's now being made elsewhere, and it puts us at a significant disadvantage. And you're right. I mean, I drive a 2004 Subaru, and it probably has a much greener environmental impact than someone who's driving a Tesla or a Prius or something like that. When you look at where those materials are sourced from, the carbon footprint to create the thing, better that we try to keep our automobiles, build them for 20 years, you know, so they last. The planned obsolescence doesn't kick in for 20 years. We'll be a lot better off, I think.
Yes. So what happened to Germany is that it used to be an industrial powerhouse for all of Europe and a great exporter. Mm-hmm. And now the remaining German industrialists are in a huge rush to move their factories, their production to China. They thought that they might move it to the United States, but that doesn't look too good. The cost of doing business in the United States is too high. The hiring practices are beyond bizarre. there are all these diversity hires. How well does that work if you're looking for engineers? Well, not very well at all.
Well, we were
Whereas in China,
attracting manufacturing back because we had dropped the price of oil. And so all of a sudden, energy became very competitive. I'm not sure that's the case right now because so many things are automated to where, like, if you're having a looming factory with all these looms in it, you don't need a lot of people anymore. A handful of people can run a large operation like that, but energy is critical.
Yes, absolutely. And Germany shot itself in the foot by cutting itself off from Russian energy. Mm-hmm. And then the U.S., of course, helped by blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. But they hurt themselves some more by shutting down their nuclear reactors. And so there's no end to what the Germans are doing to hurt themselves. And so they're no longer the industrial powerhouse of Europe and won't be. Mm-hmm. So far, they're subsisting on Chinese imports. But how long will that last? Who knows? They're not that interesting as far as China is concerned anymore.
Wow. Let's slip back into the culture wars. Go back to your thoughts on the opening ceremonies of the 2024 Olympics in Paris and what that means for what that means for the world and what's going on. What's the bigger picture there?
Well, what does that mean for the Olympic movement now that everyone has saw the opening and vomited? Well, not much. I think the fact that Thomas Bach has decided to retire is a tiny step in the right direction. But I wrote an essay called Satan Wept. Because you see, Satan, he wants to steal Christian souls, right? But there weren't any Christian souls in evidence at the opening to the Paris Olympics. These were people trying to pretend that they're demons, that they're devils or something. Mm-hmm. They were impersonating devils. They were trying to curry favor with Satan. But why does one want to curry favor with Satan if you're going to hell already, or if you're already in hell? So that was basically the logic of my essay.
Yeah, it does. It just struck me that they're really trying to shoehorn.
Basically, this is it may look like something politically interesting or fresh or politically correct from the European point of view, but from the non-European, non-American point of view, it looks like mental illness.
Interesting.
And it's not individual mental illness, it's group mental illness. So this isn't a new development. It's not a new development in Europe. They used to have something called the ship of fools in Europe, where you round up the idiots and the crazies, and you put them on a ship, some old wreck of a ship, and you set them off sailing, hoping to never see them again. So what the rest of the world wants to see is all of those people who participated in the French in the Paris Olympics opening ceremony to be put on a ship of fools and set off sailing into the North Atlantic.
Interesting. Yeah, it's it doesn't speak well for, I think, as a culture. We have this tearing of the social fabric. You know, we're sensing here in America a lack of social cohesion on so many levels. We don't share a lot of common values anymore, And I think it hurts when you're trying to put together a national agenda, and particularly one where we have a lot of players in the world that, want to do harm to America. I don't think we're able to really defend ourselves. And you can't see it, but I always keep a painting that I first saw when I was in Warsaw. And it's of a Lithuanian count named Tadas, and he's thrown himself in front of the doors of the Polish, because they had just voted to partition Poland to Russia, all these other Prussia, all these players, and basically dissolve the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And to me, that speaks to when you become so fractured internally that that the elites allow themselves to be manipulated by other players from other countries, the country will just dissolve. And it's not a good thing. It's really not a good thing. We've always been able here in the United States to rely on two oceans to protect us from a lot of this. But I'm, as you mentioned at the start of the conversation or in our pre-discussion, there is concern for, in much the way you would call, a company, is there a going concern? Well, will we be a United States 10 years from now? Will we break into, there was a book in the 80s about, the 9 nations of North America. Will we break up like that? And then what's the future then?
Well, if you look at who wants to hurt America and whom America wants to hurt, I think the hurt is all on the side of the Americans, who occupied Afghanistan for an interminable period of time, who completely demolished Iraq, who tried to demolish Syria, who armed the extremists in Chechnya, forcing Russia to fight 2 wars with them, who destroyed Libya, who bombed Belgrade, who is now arming and equipping the Ukrainians and driving them to their death at the rate of 2,000 Ukrainians dead a day. That's the United States. Now, who's trying to hurt the United States? I don't think anybody really even cares. They just want the United States to go away. That's what the rest of the world wants to go. It wants to see the United States disappear from the world scene, to withdraw its troops and basically confine itself to its geographic footprint. That would be a dream for the rest of the planet. Just not see Americans outside of America ever again. That would be dreamy.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, as far as the continued existence of a United States, well, what holds the United States united is treasury checks. About half of the people living in the United States survive on United States treasury checks. Now, if those checks start bouncing, or if they stop being delivered, or the money stops landing in the bank accounts, or if the swipey cards stop working, the United States will no longer be united.
And that's kind of where we get back into your thesis statement in Reinventing Collapse. This will be a very hard landing for us relative to, you saw what collapse looked like in the Soviet Union, but it'll be probably harder here for a number of reasons that you had talked about in the book. We don't own our homes. The bank owns them, or we rent. To get anywhere, we have to drive by automobile, which requires petrol, insurance, licensing fees, all of that. Our food stuffs are far away from us. I live here in the county of Lancaster, where we do have food and water, albeit polluted, and we have rail. But most Americans don't have that. You know, in New York City, the trucks stop running for a few days, and you're going to have starvation. So it's a gloomy picture, and you would think a country's leaders who understood just how precarious things could get would be a little more sober in their actions and reasoning, but we don't seem to have that. You had talked about all of our international engagements, our failed foreign ventures, our failed wars. It's wild. I mean, you know, from my experience at the beginning of the Second Iraq War, it was so easy to get people in the streets to protest it because there was a Republican in office. But when a Democrat was in office, you couldn't get anyone in the streets to protest these wars. It's almost, you know, we're just, in a way, we're not principle-centered enough, maybe not mature enough to understand that we're being manipulated. And either way we look at it, we go to war, young men die, and our national treasure gets dissipated and ultimately in the pockets of people that don't wish us well, internally and externally. So.
Well, the Americans that I've spent so many years living amongst pretty much just wanted to be millionaires. So it's very hard to get somebody to understand that you are being taken advantage of by a bunch of millionaires if you just want to be one.
Good
and
point.
That's basically it. That's the end.
Good point. We have been pulled away again, and it's so easy. And I think as things get more difficult economically, it's not like, okay, what can we do to build more manufacturing, more jobs, things like that. It's like, oh, hey, I'm going to go to this multi-level marketing seminar and learn how I could be a millionaire and dupe a bunch of people into being in, starting to see that again. There's all these ways to get rich. You know, right now with financialization, I know several people who spend most of their days, online trading, looking for that big hit, of the day, and it's not going to, nothing here is going, none of this is going to help us going forward, I don't think. And we got to get a little more sober about where we want to go as a country. And we can't have that conversation now because every time you try to do it, you have all these groups coming in saying, I want this for my in-group. I want that for my in-group. There's no one prepared to, put aside their personal desires and wants and look for the national good. And I mean, that sounds corny and patriotic, but that's where I think we're having.
It's not part of the culture anymore. It's just not part of the culture anymore. I don't think that it's possible to resynthesize it or recreate it. But I think the big event that's coming up is the BRICS conference in the city of Kazan in Tatarstan in October,
right,
where everyone expects a new way of countries for countries to do business financially.
And you're talking about getting off of the dollar as the world reserve currency.
Well, people are already getting off the dollar, so the dollar is no longer used in trade between Russia and China, which is huge and growing very fast, and a number of other countries. But there is no overall framework, you see, that allows everyone to bypass the US dollar. And that is what everyone expects to be introduced in Kazan in October.
Mm-hmm.
And the one country that 47 countries have filed the paperwork to join BRICS because nobody can afford to be left out of world trade once the US dollar goes bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now the United States can't afford for the US dollar to go bye-bye, of course, but it won't be let into BRICS because it broke the rules, you see.
Right. My concern looking down the road is next year, $4 trillion in debt has to be refinanced. And in the past, we've been able to rely on other countries to purchase our debt. And maybe they'll do it this time around, but will they? And what happens when they don't? Because at the end of the day, if the government can't fund itself through debt, where do we go? As you mentioned, there are all these people that rely off of getting checks from the Treasury every month. And if the government can't pay its bills and no one will loan it money, it's going to be a big problem. And it's something
it's sort of a 1-2 punch. First, the government can't stop paying out Social Security. That would be completely illegal and in nobody's power to change the law, to basically just cancel Social Security payments and other guaranteed payments, other endowments. Mm-hmm. They're not called endowments. I forget what the exact word is, but basically these are mandatory payments. Mm-hmm. The defense budget is not mandatory. You can pretty much kill the entire defense establishment. Various other government expenditures are not mandatory. They're voted each time, voted by Congress. So the first thing to do is to kill everything except social spending. But then the result of that is that the economy will shrink to such an extent that the tax base won't support social spending either. So it's basically kind of like a waterfall model of financial collapse. First step, everything goes except social spending. Second step, social spending disappears too.
Wow. No, it just doesn't look like it's going to go well. Now, I mean, this could have happened in 2008, but it didn't. We were able to, extend and pretend, push things out a bit. And I think the window of opportunity for us to do something was back in 1992 when Ross Perot was running for president, because, he saw some real issues and he wanted to get in under the hood and fix it and get us rolling along. But that wasn't going to be allowed. We weren't going to allow an outsider to come in and mess with the machine. So we're stuck kind of with what we got. And we'll see how things turn out in this upcoming election and what that could mean for the country going down the road. But when you look at these real structural issues, there's a lot of cause for concern, to say the least. But I think, we have been at this for quite some time, Dmitry. Perhaps we should begin to wind things down. Is there anything that you would like to share with the audience before we do that?
Not really specifically. I'm just generally surprised at the quality of the information that Americans have access to. And I try to do what little I can to remedy that situation. So even experts, retired CIA people, retired Army people, I hear them talk about things pertaining to Russia specifically and the Ukrainian situation, etc. They really don't have much of a clue. They say things that make Russians laugh. And that's a really bad thing. So,
as you had mentioned earlier, yes.
Yeah. And
Dmitry?
Yeah, you just froze for a second.
Yeah, so did you. So we missed probably 10 seconds of your last statement.
Oh, so please subscribe to my blog on Boosty. It's Boosty, boosty.to, which is the island of Tonga, all things, / Club Orlov, Club ORLOV. Hope to see you there.
And I will absolutely put that link in the caption, in the notes here. Dmitry, thanks so much for taking the time. It's great to reconnect with you after all this time. We got to do this more often if we're permitted to by the powers that be. You never know. The politics here in America is getting a little dicey, but always great to talk to you, Dmitry. And hoping sometime we'll be able to get together, in person and maybe 10 years from now, look back and say, okay, we were wrong. Everything ended up being great, but it may not be that way.
Well, come to Russia. There are electronic visas now that you can get. So come to Russia.
I will do that. There's a fasting camp I'd been looking at before all this madness with COVID and everything and the Ukraine war had started. But that's definitely something I will have to do. And I've heard nothing but good about St. Petersburg. So anxious to see the city.
Especially in the summer, not when there's heat all over the place.
Very good. Dmitry, take care. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, all right. So please send me a link when it's up, and I'll post it.
I absolutely will. I'm going to go ahead and real quickly here go into, I'll put you back into the green room, and then I'm going to just do my exit. And I will absolutely get the link. It'll probably be up this weekend, if not sooner.
Okay, so I'll sign off now.
Okay, take care, Dmitry. Have a good day. Thanks.
You too. Bye-bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for sticking with us to this point in the podcast. If you enjoyed what you saw here today, be sure to give it a thumbs up or a like, depending on which social media platform you are on. Please subscribe or follow us if you haven't done so already. That way, when content like this becomes available, you'll be notified. And lastly, be sure to leave a comment as well. Would love to hear from you and get your feedback on all of this. Well, Kevin Lin, Institute for Sound Public Policy, signing off, and thanks again for joining us. Bye-bye.